All right, we got another drum setup, miking setup, recording setup breakdown. So I had a Genty kind of metalcore band in the other day, and let's start with the kick. So originally I had my Yamaha 20 Maple Custom Absolute setup, which is very tight and punchy, and I wasn't sure how good the drummer was with double kick. So the smaller drum size would allow a softer hit to have more attack and more bite and more power. But as soon as we put up the 22 DW, it was just kind of game over. The other thing is I usually have a Power Stroke 3 on my kicks. And I had actually a coated one on here. I have a clear and a coated that I've been switching between. But for this setup, I switched it out for an Evans EMAD 2 with the smaller dampening ring on it. Now, next for kick mics. Kick drum mics are so particular, especially with something like this metal kind of stuff. So originally I had, I think it's a Beta 91. It's one of the Shure flat PZM style mics on the inside, which is sounding pretty good. I had D6 on the outside and a Beyer M88 on the stand on the inside. The Beyer did not sound good for this, even though it's very tight and punchy. It just didn't, it had too much hard mid-range where you want a little more almost sizzle in a metal kick. So I ended up putting the D6 on the inside, and I mean, D6 91 combo is kind of like the classic metal combo. And I was struggling to find an outside kick that would kind of give me a little bit of heft if I needed it. I ended up trying the sub kick out, which is over here right now. I had D12 VR. All of them ended up just sounding mostly like a ping pong ball, except for my favorite, the Shure Beta 52, which is just kind of my go-to for almost anything, but probably not inside metal kick mic. Next up is the snare. We had a bunch of snares pulled out, and originally my top pick was the John Tempesta snare. It's thick, it's super snappy and loud, feels good to play, kind of has that perfect combo of super attack, but still very meaty and fat when you need it. But, and he was loving that. But when we kind of switched over to this one, this was just a bit more of the preference. And so I was like, let's just go with it. I'd rather the player feel comfortable than anything else. So we went with this Beta 58 on the bottom, Transformerless 57 on the top, and I had originally an i5 under the snare, but it was not very good, at least with this setup. So we canned that. And one of the fun things was that the snare has a lot of overtone, which is a reason that I love it. But for this kind of snappy, tight, modern metal thing, it's really not the right choice. And I have this old Power Stroke 3 that came on another drum, but it was in good shape, and I ended up taking it off, and I threw it on here thinking, let's just focus up this drum. I know Andy Sneap and some of the other metal guys, that's their kind of go-to snare head, which I generally haven't been a fan of on snare because, I don't know, it feels like the snare is dead. It almost has that you put too many moon gels feel on it. But it seemed to really work for this. I also had one on one of the other snares that I had kind of set up for this session. And it just seems to really focus a drum that's maybe a little too lively. So, and in the room it feels a little weird, but under the mics, it still has nice overtone, and it's definitely not dead, which is nice. We ended up also putting on snare weight with just the level 1 kind of thing on there. And that really was just the perfect balance of dynamics, overtone, but not too ringy. Yeah, feels great, feels alive. You may be wondering why there's these weights here, and that's to hold the left kick pedal in place. All right, next up is toms. So originally I had my Gretsch toms set up because they just have so much bite and attack and lots of kind of cool texture and overtone. There's not a lot of toms on this, so I figured the references for the drums were very snappy, lots of attack, and I was like, that'll be great. But I kind of wanted to get these DWs as an option. They weren't really set up for it when I started. I had pinstripes on them, which are fine, but it's funny because old pinstripes are super smacky and attacky, but when they're new, they're just super warm. So I ended up putting emperors on them, and I ended up putting some cotton balls in, just enough to just kind of kill some of the sustain. And it turned out really good. And the drummer really preferred these. And man, this floor tom, I always have issues with it. It's just so resonant. Like it's almost uncontrollable half the time. And then like the tuning can be very, very finicky on it. It's very hard to dial it into a sweet spot. And then like get it to that next level of like really good. So anyways, it sounds good the way it is, but yeah, cotton balls on the inside, a bunch of dampening devices. I think there's even one, yeah, on the, is it there? Yeah, there's one on the bottom. And it just, it had the same like a very tight rack tom where it's just got like a boom and stops, but doesn't resonate like when the whole kit's playing. That's exactly how I got that. In the room, it almost feels a little too dead, but under the mics, it really, really comes alive. And for tom mics, we pretty much did the classic Audix D2, D4, and then I ended up putting a D2 on the bottom and a sub kick on the bottom over here. Check out all the stick shavings. But man, under toms are so good. They all of a sudden just like fill out all the low end. And I just had 2 extra channels. I'm like, let's just do it. And sounds fantastic. Okay, on to cymbals. We've got some Byzance 14s, kind of my go-to heavier hats, AKG 460. Man, really, really got to put on some headphones and move a hi-hat mic on a hi-hat because it is so particular. Like just a slight different angle can really pick up almost like nothing that good, and then really focused, clear, detailed hi-hat. And I think a lot of the time it's not where people think it is. See people doing this sometimes, they point it down at the edge. The worst place to put a hi-hat mic. Yeah. Sabian 19-inch Explosion, 19-inch HHX Evolution. This has got to be like the most used crash, best crash I've got, hands down. This one's like way more aggressive and needs to be hit a lot harder. We also had a 20-inch Explosion crash, which I originally had up here, but it was just too heavy, I think, for this drummer and what we were trying to do. And then ride-wise, my newest ride, a 21-inch AA dry ride, came in real handy. It was just super stick definition for the few parts that like had almost like bell ride parts on it. Not even like really a ride, but it sounded fantastic for it. So yeah, 460 on here, and then there was a China here. The drummer brought his 17-inch Holy China, which I hadn't loved those in the past for some reason, but this one he had just sounded fantastic. Pro 37 on it, and then there was a Splash here, which also has a Pro 37 on it, Audio-Technica. 414 overheads, classic. And I really spaced them out this time just to be like hearing the cymbals. Like I did measure to the snare, but I wasn't really paying attention to the snare. I was really paying attention to the placement of the cymbals in the overheads and just how the cymbals actually sounded in the overheads. So yeah. Last but not least, well, maybe least in this metal context, we'll see how it turns out in the mix, but room mics. Got my Royers fixed up. I was originally going to put the Coles here, but I realized I don't have a really good stereo bar for the Coles in this position where they're kind of facing the kit. And so I put the Royers up. I've loved the Royers like on this kind of thing, even though the Coles are a bit fatter and just a bit like, I don't know. They have a bit of a better like tone to them, I guess, farther away. So I ended up putting the Coles kind of behind the two gobos here. And it's important that they're facing, the front of the lobes are facing in towards the kit. I found if you do it outside, they get weird phase stuff and they don't blend very well. But these sounded really good. They both sounded really good. They need some definite processing in the mix, but they sound sick. And then I also had TLM 67 up, which I was doing some testing a while ago with it, and I realized how good of a room mic this is, especially in this room. It's very present, but still like smooth. I didn't want to use like a big ribbon as my mono kit because I wanted like more clarity, more punch, especially like to cut through like the dense metal guitars. And this really delivered. It's like as soon as you turn this up, the snare just like opens up. It's fantastic. Played around with it, moved it around in the room a little bit, found the sweet spot, and yeah, turned out fantastic. And then on we go to the actual inputs. So I ended up doing these guys on the overheads, API overheads, and I have them going into my new Tone Luxes, which cutting out about a bunch of, kind of looks like 800 hertz, and then also some 500 hertz down here, and then boosting some like about 8K up at the top, it looks like. I usually go into the curve bender, but for this one I was just kind of like, you know what, like let me try something different. This gives me a bit more options, and I wanted the curve bender on the individual mics just because I think they have a bit more, it has a bit more like cut for the close mics. So we'll see how this kind of goes moving forward depending on the sessions. But yeah, that's the overhead setup. And then we had the 91 inside kick mic going into this, or sorry, this guy here. And then we had it going on to this curve bender here, cutting out a lot of 400, boosting some 50, boosting some high end, little low pass filter, I think at like 20K. Snare going into the API as well, coming in over here, boosting bit of 91, bit of high mids, and then doing a little bit of filtering. The filtering on these curve benders is really, really broad, so I think it's like, it must be like a 6 dB slope, because like cutting at 50 goes almost all the way up to 100, and these are really just like almost filtering out like really high-end noise. Like you wouldn't actually want to use that on a mix. So it's pretty cool actually using it on the close mics. Those filters really came in handy just to kind of cut out a little bit of like extra noise bleed, you know. And then I've got snare bottom going into here. No EQ, I just kind of left it flat. Wasn't really too worried or focused on it very much. The Coles room mics are going into the curve bend, or sorry, the TG2, which this is just a perfect match. Low impedance with those Coles is a must, and the TG2 just sounds fantastic for it. I had also put the 91 through the Serpent here, it's 1176 style, and it sounded sick, but I just wasn't confident enough, and it didn't sound like so good that I should have left it in there. But I'm gonna probably try that on snare next recording I got. All right, and then we're over here. So these Wonders, the bottom one here is the D6. So boosting some high end 7K, and the EQ on this is super broad. So like it's a bit more like Pultec-y. So like 7K really reaches down. Even the 20K, like I'm like 20K, and then I looked at it on Curve Analyzer, and the 20K sweeps down to like 5K. So it's like, it's a very broad EQ, but it's also kind of got like, it's almost like a 1073 kind of thing, but like the highs are just really wide and open. Cutting some 360, boosting some 100. The lower frequencies just were too like boomy for this. So yeah, just boosting a little bit of that. This guy up here is that TLM 67 room mic, and boosting a little high end, and that's really what made like all of a sudden it just opened up real nice in the top. Cutting a little bit of that harshness in the high mids at 2.4, and then just adding a little bit of warmth in the bottom end, and then that was going into the API 525 for just a little bit of glue and compression. Got the DS feature on, which like makes it like less sensitive to low end and more sensitive to high end, and that seemed to really really kind of make it feel like more balanced. It's also on the limit setting, which just has a bit of a harder knee, which is sounding good. And then we have my go-to kick channel here, the Vintech, which I ended up using for the outside kick because that's how it ended up being patched when I was switching around the mics. Low impedance, looks like a little bit of high end, and cutting a shitload of 270 and boosting some 35. Yeah, pretty straightforward. And then we have, I believe these are the two toms, just a little bit of EQ, a little bit of bottom, a little bit of air, a little bit of snap, just to wake those Audix mics up. They're always a little dark for me on their own, but they always end up sounding very good, like in the mix, in the final drum mix. And then we've got the spot mics for, I believe, hi-hat and ride, and then China and Splash. And these are just cutting out a little low end, mostly maybe tweaking the high end depending on what I needed. But yeah, pretty straightforward. And here's a little audio sample.